Oh, the district around as well, but it was not very populous. I believe it is too late. Elida thinks they can all be gentled, Pavara said non-committally. She had already exposed herself too much. When they can send 6 to one small village and travel, there's only one answer I can see. Weep. Tarna took a deep breath, fingering the bright red stole again, but now it seemed more in regret than to play for time. Red sisters must take them as warders, Pavara. That was so startling that Pavara blinked. A hair less self-control, and she would have gaped. Are you serious? Those icy blue eyes met her gaze steadily. The worst was past, the unthinkable spoken aloud, and Tarna was a woman of stone once more. This is hardly a matter for joking. The only other choice is to let them run loose. Who else can do it? Red sisters are used to facing men like this and ready to take the necessary risks. Anyone else?
Hey, Christopher, how you doing, bro?
Each sister will have to take more than
it's good
one,
to see you.
but Greens appear to manage well enough with that. I think the Greens will faint if this is suggested to them, though. We, Red sisters, must do what needs to be done. Have you broached this to Elida? Pivara asked, and Tarna shook her head impatiently. Elida believes as you said. The yellow-haired woman frowned into her wine before going on. Elida often believes what she wants to believe, and sees what she wants to see. I tried to bring up the Ashaman the first day I was back. Not to suggest bonding, not to her, I am not a fool. She forbade me to mention them to her. But you are... unconventional. Unconventional. And do you believe they can be gentled after they're bonded? I have no idea what that would do to the sister holding the bond, and in truth, I don't want to learn.
Salut Chris, j'espère que tu vas bien. C'est bon de te voir. Salut Chris, j'espère que tu vas bien. C'est bon de te voir.
But she would have wagered everything she owned against it coming to this. That might be the end, and it might prove the other woman replied coolly. The woman was stone. Either way, I can see no other way to handle these Ashaman. Red sisters must bond them as warders. If there is any way, I will be among the first, but it must be done. She sat there, calmly sipping her wine, and for a long time Pavara could only stare at her in consternation. Nothing Tarna had said proved she was not Black Adra, yet she could not distrust every sister unable to prove that. Well, she could, and did, when it came to matters of the black, but there were other matters she had to deal with. She was a sitter, not simply a hunting dog. She had the White Tower to think of, and eyes to die far from the tower and the future. Dipping her fingers into her embroidered belt pouch, she drew out a small piece of paper rolled into a thin tube. It seemed to her that it should glow with letters of gold. So far, she was one of 2 women in the tower who knew what was written there. Even once she had it out, she hesitated before handing it to Tarna. This came from one of our agents in Kyrian, but it was sent by Tovain Ghazal. Tarna's eyes jerked to Bavara's face at the mention of Tovain's name, then fell to reading again. Her stony face did not change even after she finished, and let the paper roll back into a tube in her hand. This changes nothing, she said flatly, coldly. It only makes what I suggest more urgent. On the contrary, Pavara sighed, that changes everything. It changes the whole world. Chapter 23. Ornaments. The air in the room was just sufficiently warmer than outside to put a mist on the glass panes set in the red-painted casements, and the glass contained bubbles besides. But Catswain stood peering out as if she could see the dreary landscape clearly. She could see with more than enough clarity in any case. A few hapless folk, bundled and hatted, and only shapeless skirts or baggy breeches distinguishing men from women, were trudging the muddy fields that surrounded the manor house, sometimes stooping to feel a handful of the soil. It would not be long before they could begin their plowing and manuring, but only their inspection indicated the coming of spring any time soon. Beyond the fields, the forest was all dark, bare branches against a washed-out gray morning sky. A good coating of snow would have made the view much less bleak, but it snowed lightly and seldom here, with traces of one fall rarely lasting until the next. Still, she could think of few places better for her purposes, with the spine of the world little more than a day's hard ride to the east. Who would think to look inside the borders of Tyr? Had convincing the boy to stay here been too easy, though? With a sigh, she turned from the window, feeling the golden ornaments hanging in her hair sway, the small moons and stars, birds and fish. She was very aware of them of late. Aware? Faugh! Of late she had considered sleeping with them in place. The room was large, but not ornate, like the manor house itself, with cornices of carved wood painted red. The furniture was bright with paint, but not a touch of gilding. Two long fireplaces, plain stone if well made, the andirons sturdy wrought metal made for long service rather than appearances. The fires on the hearths were small, at her insistence, the flames flickering low on half-consumed splits. But either was enough to warm her hands, which was all she wanted. Left to his own devices, Algarin would have surrounded her with blazing warmth and smothered her in servants, few as he still employed. A lesser lord of the land, he was far from wealthy, yet he paid his debts in letter and spirit, even when most other men would have seen quite the reverse of a debt. The uncarved door to the hall creaked open. Most of Algarin's servants were nearly as old as he, and though they kept everything dusted and neat, the lamps topped with oil and the wicks trimmed, hinges in the manor seemed to escape regular oiling. The door creaked open to admit Varen, still dressed for a journey in simple brown wool with divided skirts, and carrying her cloak over her arm, still patting her gray-streaked hair into place. The stout little sister's square face wore a vexed expression, and she was shaking her head. Well, the sea folk are delivered to Tyr, Catswain. I didn't go near the stone, but I heard that High Lord Astoril stopped complaining about his creaking joints and mustered inside with Darlin. Who'd have thought Astoril would stir himself and on Darlin's side? The streets are full of armsmen, most getting drunk and picking fights with each other when they're not fighting à Vannier. There are as many sea folk in the city as everyone else put together. Harina was aghast. She went rushing out to the ships as soon as she could hire a boat, expecting to be declared mistress of the ships and set everything to rights. There seems no doubt that Nested in Rias is dead. Catswain was content to let the round little woman chatter on. Varen was not nearly so vague as she pretended. Some Browns really were capable of tripping over their own feet from not noticing them, but Varen was one of those who wore an assumed cloak of unworldliness. She seemed to believe that Catswain accepted the cloak for reality, yet if there was a point to be made, she would make it. And what she left out might be revealing, too. Catswain was less sure of the other sister than she might have wished. Uncertainty was a fact of life, but she was uncertain about entirely too many things to suit her. Unfortunately, Min must have been listening at the door, and that young woman had little patience. I told Harina it wouldn't be like that, she protested, bursting into the room. I told her she'd be punished for the bargain she made with Rand. Only after that will she become mistress of the ships, and I can't say if it will be 10 days from now or 10 years. Slim and pretty and tall in her red-heeled boots, with dark ringlets hanging to her shoulders, Min had a low, womanly voice, but she wore a boy's red coat and blue breeches. The coat was embroidered with colorful flowers on the lapels and up the sleeves, and the breeches in bands down the outsides of the legs, but they were still coat and breeches. You may come in, Min, Cadsuane said quietly. It was a tone that usually made people sit up and take notice. Those who knew her at all, anyway. Spots of color appeared in Min's cheeks. The Wave Mistress has already learned all she is going to from your viewing, I fear. But from your urgency, perhaps you've read someone else's auras and wish to tell me what you saw? The girl's peculiar ability had proved helpful in the past, and doubtless could again. Perhaps. As far as Cadsuane could tell, she did not lie about what she saw in the images and auras that she perceived floating around people, but it was not always forthcoming either. Particularly not when it came to the one person Cadsuane would have liked to know about above all others. Red cheeks or no red cheeks, Min raised her chin stubbornly. She had changed since Shadar Logoth, or perhaps it had begun earlier, but either way the change was not for the better. Rand wants you to come see him. He said to ask, so you needn't get snippy over it. Cadsuane merely looked at her and let the silence stretch. Snippy? Definitely not for the better. Tell him I will come when I am able, she said finally. Close the door firmly behind you, Min. The young woman opened her mouth as if to say something more, but at least she retained sense enough to leave it unsaid. She even made a passable curtsy, in spite of those ridiculous boots, and shut the door firmly behind her, just barely short of slamming it, in fact. Varen shook her head again, giving a laugh that sounded only slightly amused. She's in love with the young man, Cadsuane, and she's tucked her heart in his pocket. She'll follow that before her head, whatever you say or do. I think she's afraid he almost died on her, and you know how that can make a woman determined to hang on. Cadsuane's lips thinned. Varen knew more about that sort of relations with men than she did. She had never believed in indulging with her own warders, as some Greens did, and other men had always been out of the question. But the Brown had hit close to a truth without knowing. At least, Cadsuane did not think the other sister knew Min was bonded to the Al-Thor boy. She herself only knew because the girl had let too much slip in a careless moment. Even the tightest muscle eventually yielded its meat once you got that first small crack in the shell. Sometimes it gave up an unexpected pearl as well. Yes, Min would want to keep the lad alive whether she loved him or not, but no more than Cadsuane did. Draping her cloak on the tall back of a chair, Varen moved to the nearest fireplace and stretched out her hands to warm them in front of the low flames. You could not say that Varen glided, but she was more graceful than her bulk suggested. How much of her was deception? Every Aes Sedai hid behind various masks over time. It became habit after a while. I believe the situation in Tyr may be resolved peacefully yet, she said, peering into the fire. Might have been talking to herself, or wanted Cadsuane to think it. Herna and Sinan are growing quite desperate, afraid the other High Lords will return from Ilion and trap them in the city. They may be amenable to accepting Darlin, given their other choices. Estanda is made of sterner stuff, but if she can be convinced there's advantage for her in it. I told you not to go near them, Cadsuane broke in sternly. The stout woman blinked at her in surprise. I didn't. The streets are always full of rumors, and I do know how to piece rumors together and sift out a little truth. I did see Alana and Raphella, but I ducked behind a fellow hawking meat pies from a barrow before they saw me. I'm sure they didn't. She paused, clearly waiting for Cadsuane to explain why she had been told to avoid the sisters as well. I have to go to the boy now, Varen, Cadsuane said instead. That was the trouble with agreeing to advise someone. Even when you managed to set all the conditions you could wish for, most of them anyway, you still had to come sooner or later when they called, eventually. But it did give her a reason to evade Varen's curiosity. The answer was simple. If you tried to solve every problem yourself, you ended by solving none. And with some problems, how they were solved really did not matter in the long run. But not answering left Varen with a puzzle to ponder, a little butter for her paws. When Kedswain was unsure of someone, she wanted them unsure of her, too. Varen gathered up her cloak and left the room with her. Did the other woman mean to accompany her? But outside the sitting room, they encountered Nasuna walking briskly down the hall. She came to a sudden halt. No more than a handful of people had ever managed to ignore Kedswain, yet Nasuna did a credible job, her nearly black eyes latching on to Varen. You're back, then, are you? The best of Browns did have a way of stating the obvious. You wrote a paper on animals of the drowned lands, as I recall, which meant that Varen had. Nasuna recalled everything she had ever seen, a useful skill, if Kedswain had been sure enough of her to make use of it. Lord Algaran showed me the skin of a large snake he claims came from the drowned lands, but I'm convinced it is the same as I observed. Varen glanced helplessly at Kedswain over her shoulder as the taller woman drew her away by her sleeve, but before they were 3 steps along the corridor, she was deep in discussion over this fool snake. It was a remarkable sight, and troubling in a way. Nasuna was loyal to Elida, or had been, while Varen was one of those who wanted to pull Elida down, or had been. Now they talked amiably about snakes. That both had sworn fealty to the Althor boy could be laid to his being Taviran, winding the pattern around himself unconsciously. But was that oath sufficient to make them ignore their opposition over who held the Amerlin seat? Or were they affected by having a Taviran in close proximity? She would have liked very much to know that. None of her ornaments protected against Taviran. Of course, she did not know what 2 of the fish and 1 of the moons did, but it seemed unlikely they did that. It could have been as simple as Varen and Nasuna both being brown. Browns could forget everything else when they settled to study something. Snakes. Faugh. The small ornament swayed as she shook her head before turning away, leaving the 2 receding browns behind. What did the boy want? She had never liked being an advisor, necessary or not. Drafts along the corridors rippled the few tapestries on the walls, all in old styles and showing the wear of having been taken down and rehung many times. The manor house had grown like a rambling farmhouse rather than being built large, with additions added whenever the family's fortunes and numbers waxed. House Pend alone had never been wealthy, but there had been times they were numerous. The results showed in more than worn, old-fashioned wall hangings. The cornices were brightly painted, red or blue or yellow, but the hallways varied in width and height, and sometimes met at a slight skew. Windows that once had looked to the fields now looked down on courtyards, usually bare except for a few benches, and placed purely to provide light. Sometimes there was no choice in getting from here to there except to take a roofed colonnade overlooking one of those courtyards. The columns were wooden more often than not, though bravely painted even where not carved. On one of those walkways, with fat green columns, 2 sisters were standing together watching the activity in the courtyard below. At least they were watching together when Kedswain opened the door to the colonnade. Beldain saw her step out and stiffened, twitching at the green-fringed shawl she had worn fewer than 5 years. Pretty, with her high cheekbones and a slight tilt to her brown eyes, she had not yet achieved agelessness, and looked younger than Min, particularly when she shot Kedswain a frosty stare and hurried from the colonnade in the other direction. Maurice, her companion, smiled after her in amusement, shifting her own green-fringed shawl slightly. Tall and usually quite serious, with her hair drawn back tightly from her pale face, Maurice was not a woman who smiled often. Beldain, she is becoming concerned that she has no warder yet, she said in the accents of Tarabon as Kedswain stopped beside her, though her blue eyes returned to the courtyard. She seems to be considering an Ashaman, if she can find one. I told her to talk to Daigyan. If it does not help her, it will help Daigyan. All of the warders they had with them were gathered in the stone-paved yard, in their shirt sleeves despite the cold, most seated on painted wooden benches watching two of their number work with wooden practice swords. Jahar, one of Maurice's three, was a pretty, sun-dark young man. The silver bells fastened to the ends of his two long braids chimed with the fury of his attack. He moved like a striking black lance. Not a breath of breeze stirred, but the eight-pointed star, like a golden compass rose, seemed to shift against Cadsuane's hair. Had it been held in her hand, she could have felt it vibrating clearly. But then she already knew that Jahar was an Ashaman, and the star would not have pointed him out, merely told her that a man who could channel was nearby. The more men who could channel, the harder the star quivered, she had learned. Jahar's opponent, a very tall, broad-shouldered fellow with a stone face and a braided leather cord around his graying temples to hold back shoulder-length hair, was not the second Ashaman down there, but he was as deadly.
Cheers, Christopher.
Lan did not really seem to
About
move
to
that fast.
load up a dab real quick.
Flowed. His blade of bundled laths was always there to defend
How you been
Jahar's,
doing, Chris?
always moving the younger man just a touch more out of his line. Suddenly, Lan's wooden blade struck Jahar's side with a resounding crack, a killing blow given with steel. While the younger man was still flinching from the force of the strike, Lan fell back into a ready stance, long blade upright in his hands. Nethan, another of Maurice's, rose to his feet, a lean fellow with wings of white at his temples and tall, if still a hand or more shorter than Lan. Jahar waved him away and raised his practice blade again, loudly demanding another go. "Is Daigyan still bearing up?" Cadsuane asked. "Better than I expected," Maurice admitted. "She stays in her room too much, but she keeps her weeping private." Her gaze shifted from the men dancing their swords to a green-painted bench, where Varen's stocky, gray-haired Tomas sat next to a grizzled fellow with only a fringe of white hair remaining.
Some light resin
refused.
sugar wax.
She may never have had a warder before, but she knows that the grieving over a dead warder is part of remembering him. I am surprised that Coriel would consider allowing it. With a shake of her head, the Taraboner's sister returned to studying Jahar. Other sisters' warders did not really interest her, at least not like her own. Ashaman, they grieve as warders do. I thought perhaps Jahar and Damer merely followed the lead of the others, but Jahar, he says it is their way too. I did not intrude, of course, but I watched them drink in memory of Daigyan's young Eben. They never mentioned his name, but they had a full wine cup sitting for him. Sana and Nathan can die on any day, and they accept that. Jahar expects to die. Every day he expects it. To him, every hour is most assuredly his last. Cadsuane barely refrained from glancing at the other woman. Maurice did not often go on at such length. The other woman's face was smooth, her manner unruffled, but something had upset her. "I know you practice linking with him," she said delicately, peering down into the courtyard. Delicacy was required in talking to another sister about her warder. That was part of the reason she stared into the courtyard, frowning. "Have you decided yet whether the Althor boys succeeded at Shadar Logoth? Did he really manage to cleanse the male half of the source?" Coriel practiced linking with Dahmer, too, but the Yellow was so focused on her futile efforts to reason out how he did with Saidar what he did with Saidin that she would not have noticed the Dark One's taint sliding down her throat. A pity she herself had not come to the shawl 50 years later than she had, or she would have bonded one of the men herself and had no need to ask. 50 years would have meant that Norla died in the Black Hills before Cadsuane Malone White Town. A great deal of history. It would have been unlikely that she would be in anything approaching her present circumstances. So she asked, delicately, and waited. Maurice was quiet and still for a long moment, and then she sighed. "I do not know, Cadsuane. Saidar is a calm ocean that will take you wherever you want, so long as you know the currents and let them carry you. Dean, an avalanche of burning stone, collapsing mountains. It feels cleaner than when I first linked with Jahar, but anything could hide in that chaos. Anything. Cadswain nodded. She was not sure she had expected any other answer. Why should she find any certainty about one of the two most important questions in the world, when she could find none on so many simpler matters? In the courtyard, Lan's wooden blade stopped, not with a crack this time, just touching Jahar's throat, and the bigger man flowed back to his waiting stance. Nethan stood again, and again Jahar waved him back, angrily raising his sword and setting himself. Maurice's third, Basana, a short, wide fellow, nearly as sun-dark as Jahar, for all he was Kyrianan, laughed and made a rude comment about overambitious men tripping on their own blades. Tomas and Dahmer exchanged glances and shook their heads. Men of that age usually had given up taunting long ago. The fight of wood on wood began once more. The other four warders were not the only audience for Lan and Jahar in the courtyard. The slim girl with her dark hair in a long braid, watching anxiously from a red bench, was the focus of Cadswain's frown. The child would need to flash her great serpent ring under people's noses to be taken for Aes Sedai, which she was, if just technically. It was not only because Nynaeve's face was a girl's face. Beldain still seemed as young. Nynaeve bounced on the bench, always on the point of leaping up. Occasionally her mouth moved as if she were silently shouting encouragement, and sometimes her hands twisted as though demonstrating how Lan should have moved his sword. A frivolous girl, full of passions, who only rarely demonstrated that she had a brain. Min was not the only one to have thrown her heart and head both down the well over a man. The curtains of dead Malkir, the red dot painted on Nynaeve's forehead, indicated her marriage to Lan, though Yellows seldom married their warders. Very few sisters did, for that matter. And of course Lan was not Nynaeve's warder, however much he and the girl pretended otherwise. Who he did belong to was a matter they evaded like thieves, slipping through the night. More interesting, more disturbing, was the jewelry Nynaeve wore. A long gold necklace and slim gold belt with matching bracelets and finger rings, the gaudy red and green and blue gems that studded them clashing with her yellow-slashed dress. And she wore that peculiar piece as well on her left hand, with the golden rings attached to the golden bracelet by flat chains. That was an angreal, much stronger than Cadswain's shrike hair ornament. The others were much like her own decorations too, terangreal and plainly made at the same time during the breaking of the world, when an Aes Sedai might find many hands turned against her, most especially those of men who could channel. Strange to think that they had been called Aes Sedai too. It would be like meeting a man called Cadswain. The question, her morning seemed filled with questions, and the sun not halfway to noon yet. The question was, did the girl wear her jewelry because of the Althor boy, or the Ashaman, or because of Cadswain Malydran? Nynaeve had demonstrated her loyalty to a young man from her own village, and she had shown her wariness of him as well. She did have a brain when she chose to use it. Until that question was answered, however, trusting the girl too far was dangerous. The trouble was, little these days did not seem dangerous. Jahar is growing stronger, Maurice said abruptly. For an instant, Cadswain frowned at the other green. Stronger? The young man's shirt was beginning to cling damply to his back, while Lan appeared not to have broken his first sweat. Then she understood. Maurice meant in the power. Cadswain only raised a questioning eyebrow, though. She could not recall the last time she had let shock reach her face. It might have been all those years ago in the Black Hills when she began earning the ornaments she now wore. At first, I thought the way these Ashaman train, the forcing, had pushed him to his full strength already, Maurice said, frowning down at the two men working their practice blades. No, it was at Jahar she was frowning. Just a faint crinkle of her eyes, but she reserved her frowns for those who could see and know her displeasure. At Shadar Logos, I thought. I must be imagining it. 3 or 4 days ago, I was half convinced I was mistaken. Now, I am sure I am correct. If men gain strength by fits and starts, there is no saying how strong he will become. She did not voice her obvious worry, of course, that he might grow stronger than she. Saying such a thing would have been unthinkable on many different levels, and while Maurice had become somewhat accustomed to doing the unthinkable, most sisters would faint at the very idea of bonding a man who could channel. She was never comfortable giving them voice. Cat Swain was, yet she kept her voice neutral. Light, but she hated being delicate. Hated the necessity, anyway. He seems content, Maurice. Maurice's warders always seemed content. She handled them well. He is in a fury of... The other woman touched the side of her head, as though fingering the bundle of sensations she felt through the bond. She really was upset. Not rage, frustration. Reaching into her green worked leather belt pouch, she took out a small enameled pin, a sinuous figure in red and gold, like a snake with legs and a lion's mane. I do not know where the Althor lad got this, but he gave it to Jahar. Apparently for Ashaman, it is akin to attaining the shawl. I had to take it away, of course. Jahar, he is still at the stage where he has to learn to accept only what I say he can. But he is so agitated over the thing. Should I give it back to him? In a way, it would come from my hand then. Cadswain's eyebrows began to climb before she could control them. Maurice was asking advice about one of her warders? Of course, Cadswain had suggested she sound the man out in the first place, but this degree of intimacy was unthinkable. Faugh. I'm sure whatever you decide will be correct. With one last glance at Nynaeve, she left the taller woman stroking the enameled pin with her thumb and frowning down into the courtyard. Lan had just defeated Jahar once more, but the young man was squaring up again, demanding yet another match. Whatever Maurice decided, she had already learned one thing she did not like. The boundaries between Aes Sedai and warders had always been as clear as the connections. Aes Sedai commanded and warders obeyed. But if Maurice, of all people, was dithering over a collar pin, Maurice, who managed her warders with a firm hand, then new boundaries would have to be worked out, at least with warders who could channel. It seemed unlikely that bonding them would stop now. Beldain was evidence for that. People never really changed, yet the world did, with disturbing regularity. You just had to live with it, or at least live through it. Now and then, with luck, you could affect the direction of the changes, but even if you stopped one, you only set another in motion. As expected, she did not find the door to the Althor boys' rooms unguarded. Olivia was there, of course, seated on a bench to one side of the door with her hands folded patiently in her lap. The pale-haired Shanshan woman had appointed herself the boy's protector of sorts. Olivia credited him with freeing her from a Damani's collar, but there was more to it than that. Men disliked her, for one thing, and it was not the usual sort of jealousy. Olivia hardly seemed to know what men and women did together. But there was a connection between her and the boy, a connection revealed in glances that carried determination on her side, and on his, hope, hard as that was to believe. Until Cadswain knew what that was all about, she intended to do nothing to separate them. Olivia's sharp blue eyes regarded Cadswain with a respectful wariness, but she did not see an enemy. Olivia had a short way with those she considered the Althor boys' enemies. The other woman on guard was much of a size with Olivia, but the two could not have been more different, and not just because Elza's eyes were brown, and she had the smooth, ageless look of Aes Sedai, where Olivia had fine lines at the corners of her eyes, and threads of white almost hidden in her hair. Elza leaped to her feet as soon as she saw Cadswain, drawing herself up in front of the door and wrapping herself tight in her shawl. He's not alone, she said, frost rhyming her voice. Do you mean to stand in my way? Cadsuane asked, just as coldly. The Andorran green should have moved aside. Elsa stood far enough below her in the power that she should not have hesitated, much less waited for a command, but the woman planted her feet, and her gaze actually grew heated. It was a quandary. 5 other sisters in the manor house had sworn fealty to the boy, and those who had been loyal to Elida all stared at Cadsuane as if suspicious of her intentions toward him, which raised the question of why Baron did not, of course. But only Elsa tried to keep her away from him. The woman's attitude reeked of jealousy, which made no sense. She could not possibly believe herself better suited to advise him, and if there had been any suggestion that Elsa desired the boy as a man or a warder, men would have been snarling. The girl had finely honed instincts there. Cadsuane would have ground her teeth, had she been the sort of woman to grind her teeth. At the point when she thought she would have to order Elsa to step aside, Olivia leaned forward. "You did send for her, Elsa," she drawled. "He'll be upset if we keep her out. Upset with us, not her. Let her in." Elsa glanced at the Shanshan woman from the corner, and her lip curled in contempt. Olivia stood far above her in the power. Olivia stood well above Cadsuane, for that matter, but she was a wilder, and a liar in Elsa's view. The dark-haired woman hardly seemed to accept that Olivia had been Damani, much less the rest of her story. Still, Elsa darted a look at Cadsuane, then at the door behind her, and shifted her shawl. Plainly, she did not want the boy upset. Not with her. "I'll see whether he's ready for you," she said, very near to sullen. "Keep her here," she added to Olivia more sharply before turning to knock lightly at the door. A male voice called from the other side, and she opened the door just wide enough to slip in, pulling it shut behind her. "You'll have to forgive her," Olivia said, in that irritatingly slow, soft Shanshan accent. "I think it's just that she takes her oath very seriously. She isn't used to serving anyone." "Aes Sedai keep their word," Cadsuane replied dryly. The woman made her feel as if her own way of talking were as quick and crisp as a Kyrianen's. "We must." "I think you do. Just so you know, I keep my word, too. I owe him anything he wants of me." A fascinating comment, and an opening, but before she could take advantage of it, Elsa came out. Behind her came Algarin, white beard trimmed to a neat point. He offered Cadsuane a bow, with a smile that deepened the wrinkles of his face. His plain coat of dark wool, made in his younger days, hung loosely on him now, and the hair on his head provided a thin covering. There was no chance to find out why he had been visiting the Althor boy. "He will see you now," Elsa said sharply. Cadsuane very nearly did grind her teeth. Olivia would have to wait, and Algarin. The boy was on his feet when Cadsuane entered, almost as tall and broad-shouldered as Lan, in a black coat worked with gold on the sleeves and the high collar. It was too much like an Ashaman's coat with embroidery added to suit her, but she said nothing. He made a courteous bow, ushering her to a chair with a tasseled cushion in front of the fireplace, and asking whether she would like wine. That in the pitcher, sitting on a side table with 2 wine cups, had gone cold, but he could send for more. She had worked hard enough to force him into civility. He could wear any coat he wanted. There were more important matters he had to be guided in, or prodded, or pulled as need be. She was not going to waste time or talk on his clothing. Inclining her head politely, she declined the wine. A wine cup offered many opportunities. To sip when you needed a moment's thought, to peer into when you wished to hide your eyes, yet this young man needed watching every moment. His face gave away almost as little as a sister's. With that dark reddish hair and those blue-gray eyes, he could have passed for Aiel, but few Aiel had eyes that cold. They made the morning sky she had been staring at earlier seem warm, colder than they had been before Shadar Logoth. Harder, too, unfortunately. They also looked weary. Algarin had a brother who could channel, he said, turning toward a facing chair. Halfway into the turn, he staggered. He caught himself on an arm of the chair with a barked laugh, pretending he had tripped over his own boots. But there had been no tripping. And he had not seized Saidine. She had seen him stagger doing that, or her ornaments would have warned her. Coreel said he only needed a little more sleep to recover from Shadar Logoth. Light, she needed to keep the boy alive, or it had all been for nothing. I know, she said. And since it seemed Algarin might have told him everything, she added, I was the one who captured Imarin and took him to Tarvalon. A strange thing for Algarin to be grateful for, in some eyes, but his younger brother survived being gentled for more than 10 years after she had helped him reconcile to it. The brothers had been close. The boy's eyebrows twitched as he settled into his chair. He had not known. Algarin wants to be tested, he said. She met his gaze levelly, serenely, and held her tongue. Algarin's children were married, those who still lived. Maybe he was ready to turn this piece of land over to his descendants. In any case, one man more or less who could channel hardly made any difference at this point. Unless it was the boy who was staring at her. After a moment, his chin moved, the vestige of a nod. Had he been testing her? Never fear that I'll fail to tell you when you're being a fool, boy. Most people remembered that after one meeting she had a sharp tongue. This young man required reminding from time to time. He grunted. It might have been a laugh. It might have been rueful. She reminded herself that he wanted her to teach him something, though he did not seem to know what. No matter. She had a list to choose from, and she had only begun on it. His face might have been carved from stone for all the expression he showed, but he bounded to his feet and began to pace back and forth between the fireplace and the door. His hands were clenched in fists behind his back. I've been talking with Olivia about the Shanshan, he said. They call their army the ever-victorious army for a reason. It's never lost a war. Battles, yes, but never a war. When they lose a battle, they sit down and work out what they did wrong or what the enemy did right. Then they change what needs changing for them to win. A wise way, she said when the flow of words paused. Plainly, he expected some comment. I know men who do the same. Davram Bashir, for one. Gareth Bryn, Brodel Etoralda, Agilmar Jagad. Even Pedron Nile did when he was alive. All judged great captains. Yes, he said, still pacing. He did not look at her, perhaps did not see her, but he was listening. It was to be hoped that he actually heard as well. 5 men, all great captains. The Shanshan all do it. That's been their way for 1,000 years. They change what they have to change, but they don't give up. Are you considering the possibility they can't be defeated? She asked calmly. Calmness always suited until you knew the facts. And usually after, too. The boy rounded on her, stiff-necked and eyes like ice. I can defeat them eventually, he said, struggling to keep his tone civil. That much was to the good. The less often she had to prove that she could and would punish transgressions of her rules, the better.
Be right back, everyone.
He cut off with a growl as the sounds of argument in the hallway penetrated the door. A moment later, the door swung open, and Elsa backed into the room, still arguing in a loud voice and trying to hold back 2 other sisters with her spread arms. Arian, her pale face flushed with color, was pushing the other green ahead of her physically. Serene, a woman so beautiful she made Arian look almost ordinary, wore a cooler expression, as might be expected from a white, but she was shaking her head in exasperation, and hard enough to make the colorful beads in her thin braids click together. Serene possessed a temper, though she normally kept it sealed away tightly. Bartol and Rashan do be coming, Ariane announced loudly, agitation thickening Ilion in her speech. Those were her 2 warders left behind in Kyrian. I did not send for them, but someone did travel with them. An hour ago I felt them suddenly closer, and just now closer again. They're coming toward us now. My Vitalian, he also is coming closer, Serene said. He will be here in a few hours, I think. Elsa let her arms drop, though from the stiffness of her back she was still glaring at the two sisters. My Firo will be here shortly as well, she muttered. He was her only warder. It was said they were married, and Greens who married seldom took another warder at the same time. Catswain wondered whether she would have spoken if the others had not. I didn't expect it so soon, the boy said softly. Softly, but there was steel in his voice. But I shouldn't have expected events to wait on me, should I, Catswain? Events never wait on anyone, she said, standing. Ariane flinched as if she had just noticed her, though Catswain was sure her face was as smooth as the boy's, and maybe as stony at that. What had brought those warders from Kyrian, and who had traveled with them, might be problems enough to go on with, but she thought she had gotten another answer from the boy, and she was going to have to consider very carefully how to advise him on it. Sometimes the answers were thornier than the questions.
Chapter 24. A Strengthening Storm. Mid-afternoon sunlight should have been slanting through the windows of Rand's bedchamber, but a hard rain was falling outside, and all the lamps were lit to hold off a twilight darkness. Thunder rattled the glass-filled casements in the windows. It was a fierce storm that had rolled down out of the dragon wall faster than a running horse and brought a deeper cold, almost deep enough for snow. The raindrops pelting the house were half-frozen slush, and despite blazing logs in the hearthstone, a chill clung to the room. Lying on his bed with his booted feet propped one atop the other on the coverlet, he stared up at the canopy and tried to put his thoughts in order. He could disregard the thunderstorm outside, but Min, snuggling under his arm, was another matter. She did not try to distract him. She just did it without trying. What was he to do about her? About Elaine and Avienda? Those two were only vague presences in his head at this distance from Camelin. At least, he assumed they were still in Camelin. Assuming was dangerous when it came to those two. All he had of them at the moment was a general sense of direction and the knowledge they were alive. Min's body was pressed tight against his side, though, and the bond made her as vibrant inside his head as she was in the flesh. Was it too late to keep Min safe? To keep Elaine and Avienda safe? What makes you think you can keep anyone safe? Luz Theron whispered in his head. The dead madman was an old friend now. We are all going to die. Just hope that you aren't the one who kills them. Not a welcome friend, just one he could not rid himself of. He no longer feared killing Min or Elaine or Avienda, any more than he feared going mad. Madder than he already was, at least, with a dead man in his head and sometimes a foggy face he could almost recognize. Did he dare ask Catswain about either one? Trust no one, Luz Theron murmured, then gave a wry laugh. Including me. Without warning, Min punched him in the ribs hard enough to make him grunt. You're getting melancholy, sheepherder, she growled. If you're worrying about me again, I swear I'll... She had so many different ways of growling, Min did. Each matched to very different sensations through the bond. There was the light irritation he felt from her now, this time touched with worry, and sometimes there was a sharp edge, as if she were refraining from snapping his head off. There was a growl that almost made him laugh from the amusement in her head, or as close to laughing as he had come in what seemed a very long time, and a throaty growl that would have heated his blood, even without the bond. None of that now, she said warningly, before he could move the hand resting on her back, and rolled off the bed sheet, tugging her embroidered coat straight with a reproving look. Since bonding him, she was even better at reading his mind, and she had been good enough before. What are you going to do about them, Rand? What is Catswain going to do? Lightning flashed in the windows, almost bright enough to wash out the lamps, and thunder boomed against the window glass. I haven't yet been able to see what she was going to do ahead of time, Min. Why should today be different? The thick feather mattress sagged beneath him as he swung his legs over the side and sat up facing her. He almost pressed a hand to the old wounds in his side without thinking, then caught himself and changed the movement to buttoning up his coat. Half healed and never healing, those two overlapping wounds hurt since Shada Logath. Or maybe he was just more aware of how they throbbed. The heat of them a furnace of fever, trapped in an area smaller than the palm of his hand. One, at least he hoped, would begin to heal with Shada Logath gone. Maybe there had just not been enough time yet for him to feel any difference. It was not the same side that Minute fisted. She was always gentle with that, if not always with the rest of him. But he thought he had kept the pain hidden from her. No point in giving her something more to worry over. The concern in her eyes and in her head must be about Cadswain. Or the others. The manor house and all of its outlying buildings were now. It had seemed inevitable that sooner or later someone would try using the warders left in Kyrian. Their Aes Sedai had not blared that they were going off to find the Dragon Reborn, but neither had they been particularly secretive. So they never anticipated those who had arrived with them. Davram Bashir, with 100 of his Saldean light horse, dismounting in a wind-driven soaking rain and muttering about ruined saddles. For half a dozen black-coated Ashaman, who for some reason had not shielded themselves from the downpour. They rode with Bashir, but it had been like two parties arriving, a little distance between them always, a strong whiff of watchful wariness. And one of the Ashaman was Logain Ablar. Logain? An Ashaman wearing the sword and dragon on his collar. Bashir and Logain both wanted to talk to him, but not in front of anyone, especially each other, it seemed. Unexpected or not, though, they were hardly the most surprising of the visitors. He had thought the 8 Aes Sedai must be more friends of Cadswain, yet he would swear she had been as surprised as he to see most of them. Odder, all but one seemed to be with the Ashaman. Not prisoners, and certainly not guards, but Logain had been reluctant to explain with Bashir present, and Bashir reluctant to leave Logain the first chance to talk to Rand alone. Now they were all drying off and settling into their rooms, leaving him to try to put his thoughts in order, to the extent that he could, with Min close by. What would Cadswain do? Well, he had tried to ask her advice. Events had outrun both of them, though. The decision had been made, whatever Cadswain thought. Lightning flashed again in the windows. Lightning seemed to suit Cadswain. You could never tell where it would strike. Olivia would finish her, Luce Theron muttered. She's going to help us die. She'd remove Cadswain for us if you tell her to. I don't want to kill her, Rand thought of the dead man. I can't afford for her to die. Luce Theron knew that as well as he, but the man grumbled under his breath anyway. Since Shada Logath, he seemed a touch less mad sometimes. Or maybe Rand was a touch more. After all, he took to talking to a dead man in his head as a matter of every day, and that was hardly sane. You have to do something, Min muttered, folding her arms beneath her breasts. Logain's aura still speaks of glory, stronger than ever. Maybe he still thinks he's the real Dragon Reborn. And there's something dark in the images I saw around Lord Davram. If he turns against you or dies, I heard one of the soldiers say Lord Dobrain might die. Losing even one of them would be a blow. Lose all three, and it might take you a year to recover. If you've seen it, then it's going to happen. I have to do what I can, Min, not worry over what I can't. She gave him one of those looks women had in great store, as if he were trying to start an argument. Scratching at the door brought his head around and made Min shift her stance. He suspected she had slipped a throwing knife out of her sleeve and was hiding it behind her wrist. The woman carried more knives tucked about her than Tom Marilyn had. Or Matt. Colors whirled in his head, almost resolving into... what? A man on a wagon seat. Not the face that sometimes appeared in his thoughts anyway, and the scene was gone in an instant, without any of the dizziness that accompanied the face. Come, he called, standing up. Elsa spread her dark green skirts in an elegant curtsy when she entered, her eyes bright on his face. Pleasant-appearing woman, and coolly complacent as a cat, she hardly seemed to see men. Of all the sisters who had sworn to him, Elsa was the most eager. The only eager one, really. The others had their reasons for swearing, their explanations, and of course Varen and the sisters who came to find him at Demise Wells had no real choice facing into Viren. But for all Elsa's outer coolness, she seemed to burn inside with a passion to see he reach Tarmangaiden. You said to let you know when the Ogier came, she said. never taking her eyes from his face. "Loyal!" Min shouted gleefully, tucking the knife back up her sleeve as she rushed past Elsa, who blinked at the sight of the blade. "I could have killed Rand for letting you get off to your room before I saw you." The Bond said she did not mean it. Not exactly. "Thank you," Rand told Elsa, listening to the sounds of merriment from the sitting room, Min's light laughter and Loyal's quake of Ogier mirth, like the earth laughing. Thunder rolled across the sky. Perhaps the Aes Sedai's passion extended to wanting to know what he said to Loyal, because her lips thinned and she hesitated before making another curtsy and sweeping out of the bedchamber. A brief pause in the sounds of pleasure announced her passage across the sitting room, and their resumption her departure. Only then did he seize the power. He tried never to let anyone see him do that. Fire flooded into him, hotter than the sun, and cold to make the worst blizzard seem spring, all a swirling rage that dwarfed the storm outside, threatening to scour him away for a moment's inattention. Seizing Saidin was a war for survival. But the green of the cornices was suddenly greener, the black of his coat blacker, the gold of its embroidery more golden. He could see the grain of the vine-carved bedposts, see faint marks left by the craftsman's sanding all those years ago. Saidin made him feel as if he had been half blind and numb without it. That was a part of what he felt. "Clean," Luz Theron whispered. "Pure and clean again." It was. The foulness that had marked the male half of the power since the breaking was gone. That did not stop nausea from rising in Rand, though, the violent urge to bend double and empty himself on the floor. The room seemed to spin for an instant, and he had to put a hand on the nearest bedpost to steady himself. He did not know why he should still feel this sickness with the taint gone. Luz Theron did not know, or would not tell. But the sickness was the reason he could not let anyone see him take hold of Saidin, if he could help it. Elsa might burn to see him reach the last battle, but too many others wanted to see him fall. Not all of them dark friends. In that moment of weakness, the dead man reached for Saidin. Rand could feel him clawing for it greedily. Was it harder than it had been to push him away? In some ways, Luz Theron seemed more solidly part of him since Shadar-Logoth. It did not matter. He had only so far left to go before he could die. He just had to last that far. Drawing a deep breath, he ignored the lingering traces of sickness in his belly and strode into the sitting room to the crash of thunder. Min stood in the middle of the room, holding one of Loyal's hands in both of hers and smiling up at him. It took both of her hands to hold one of Loyal's, and the pair did not come close to covering it. The top of his head missed the plaster ceiling by little more than a foot. He had donned a fresh coat of dark blue wool, the bottom flaring over baggy trousers to the tops of his knee-high boots. But for once his pockets did not bulge with the angular shapes of books. Eyes the size of teacups lit up at the sight of Rand, and the grin on his wide mouth really did split his face in two. The tufted ears sticking up through his shaggy hair quivered with pleasure.
"Lord Algarin has Ogier guest rooms, Rand,"
He boomed in a voice like a deep drum.
"Can you imagine it? 6 of them. Of course, they haven't been used in some time, but they're aired out every week, so there isn't any mustiness. And the bed sheets are very good linen. I thought I'd be back to doubling myself up in a human-sized bed. We aren't staying here long, are we?"
His long ears sagged a little, then began to twitch uneasily.
"I don't think we should. I mean, I might get used to having a real bed, and that wouldn't do if I'm going to stay with you. I mean, well, you know what I mean."
"I know," Rand said softly. He could have laughed at the Ogier's consternation. He should have laughed. Laughter just seemed to have escaped him lately. Spinning a web against eavesdropping around the room, he knotted it so he could release Saidin. The last traces of nausea began to fade immediately. He could control the sickness usually, with an effort, but there was no point when he did not have to. "Did any of your books get wet?" Loyal's main concern coming in had been to check on his books. Suddenly it struck him that he had thought of what he had done as spinning a web. That was how Luz Theron would put it. That sort of thing happened too often. The other man's turns of phrase drifting into his head, the other man's memories mingling with his. He was Randall Thor, not Luz Theron Telemon. He had woven a ward and tied off the weave, not spun a web and knotted it. But the one came to him as easily as the other.
My essays of Willem Menetjes got damp,
Loyal said disgustedly, rubbing his upper lip with a finger the thickness of a sausage. Had he been careless shaving, or was that the beginning of a mustache beneath his wide nose?
The pages may smart. I shouldn't have been so careless, not with a book. And my book of notes took some wet too. But the ink didn't run. Everything is still readable, but I really need to make a case to protect.
Slowly, a frown crept onto his face, dangling the long ends of his eyebrows onto his cheeks.
You look tired, Rand. He looks tired, Min.
He's been doing too much, but he's resting now, Min said defensively, and Rand did smile. A little. Min would always defend him, even to his friends. You are resting, sheep herder, she added, letting go of Loyal's huge hand and planting her fists on her hips. Sit down and rest. Oh, sit down, Loyal. I'll put a crick in my neck if I keep staring up at you. Loyal chuckled, the bellowing of a bull muted in his throat, as he examined one of the straight-back chairs dubiously. Compared to him, it seemed a chair made for a child.
Sheep herder. You don't know how good it is to hear you calling him sheep herder, Min.
He sat down cautiously. The plain-carved chair creaked under his
You
weight.
1 second there, though.
Stuck up in front of him.
I am sorry, but it is funny, and I haven't heard much to laugh at these past months.
The chair was holding. With a quick glance toward the hall door, he added, a little too loudly,
Alden doesn't have much sense of humor.
You can speak freely, Rand told him. We're safe behind a ward. He'd almost said behind a shield, which was not the same thing, except that he knew it was. He was too weary to sit, just as he was too tired to find sleep easily most nights. His bones ached with it. So he went to stand in front of the fireplace. Winds gusting across the chimney top made the flames dance on the split logs and sometimes let a small puff of smoke into the room, and he could hear the rain drumming away at the windows, but the thunder seemed to have moved on. Maybe the storm was ending. Clasping his hands behind his back, he turned away from the fire. What did the elders say, Loyal? Instead of answering straight away, Loyal looked at Min as if seeking encouragement or support. Perched on the edge of a blue armchair with her knees crossed, she smiled at the Ogier and nodded, and he sighed heavily, a wind gusting through deep caverns.
Alden and I visited every steady, Rand. Orbit steady for Shanghai, of course. I couldn't go there, but I left a message everywhere we went. And Daiking isn't far from Shanghai. Someone will carry it there. The Great Stump is meeting in Shanghai, and that will attract crowds. This is the first time a Great Stump has been called in 1,000 years. Not since you humans fought the War of 100 Years. And it was Shanghai's turn. They must be considering something very important, but no one would tell me why it was called. They won't tell you about any stuff until you have a beard,
He muttered, fingering a narrow patch of stubble on his broad chin. Apparently he intended to remedy his lack, though it was not certain that he could. Loyal was over 90 years old now, yet for an Ogier, that was still a boy. The elders? Rand asked patiently. Who had to be patient with Loyal, with any Ogier. They did not see time the way humans did. Who among humans would think of whose turn it was after 1,000 years? And Loyal tended to go on at length, given half a chance. Great length. Loyal's ears twitched, and he gave Min another look, received another encouraging smile in return.
Well, as I said, I visited all the steady but Shanghai. Alden wouldn't go inside. He'd rather sleep every night under a bush than be cut off from the source for a minute.
Rand did not say a word, but Loyal raised his hands from his knees, palms out.
I'm getting to the point, Rand. I am. I did what I could. I don't know whether it was enough. The steading in the borderlands told me to go home and leave matters to older and wiser heads. So did Shadoon and Mardoon in the mountains on the Shuttle Coast. The other steading agreed to guard the way gates. I don't think they really believe there's any danger, but they agreed. So you know they will keep a close guard. And I'm sure someone will take word to Shanghai. The elders in Shanghai never liked having a waygate right outside the steading. I must have heard Elder Hammond say 100 times that it was dangerous. I know they'll agree to have it watched.
Rand nodded slowly. Ogier never lied, or at least the few who made an attempt were so poor at it that they seldom tried a second time, and Ogier's word was taken as seriously as anyone else's sworn oath. The way gates would be guarded closely, except for those in the borderlands and the mountains south of Amadisia and Tarabon. From gate to gate, a man could journey from the spine of the world to the Arth Ocean, from the borderlands to the Sea of Storms, all in a strange world somehow outside of time, or maybe alongside it. 2 days walking along the ways could carry you 100 miles or 500, depending on the paths you chose, and if you were willing to risk the dangers. You could die very easily in the ways, or worse. The ways had turned dark and corrupted long ago. Trollocs did not care about that, though, at least not when they had Murdroll driving them. Trollocs, especially when they had Murdroll driving them. And 9 way gates would remain unwatched, the danger that any of them might open Trollocs by the tens. Setting any sort of guard operation might be impossible. Many people did not believe Ogier existed, and few of those who did wanted to meddle without leave. Maybe the Ashaman, if he had enough he could trust. Suddenly he realized that he was not the only one who was tired. Loyal was his loosely on him. It was for an Ogier to be outside the steading too long, and Loyal had left his home a good 5 years ago. Maybe those brief visits over the last few months had not been enough for him. Maybe you should go home now, Loyal. Steading Shanghai is only a few days from here. Loyal's chair creaked alarmingly as he sat bolt upright. His ears shot upright too, in alarm.
My mother will be there, Rand. She's a famous speaker. She would never miss a great stump.
She can't have come all the way back from the 2 rivers already, Rand told him. Loyal's mother was supposedly a famous walker, too. Yet there were limits, even for Ogier.
You don't know my mother,
Loyal muttered, a drum booming darkly.
She'll still have Aerith in tow, too. She will.
Min leaned toward the Ogier, a dangerous light in her eyes. The way you talk about Aerith, I know you want to marry her. So why do you keep running from her? Rand studied her from the fireplace. Marriage. Avienda assumed that he would marry her, and Elaine and Min as well, in the Aiel fashion. Elaine appeared to think so too, strange as that seemed. He thought she did. What did Min think? She had never said. He should never have let them bond him. The bond would smother them in grief when he died. Loyal's ears trembled with caution now. Those ears were one reason Ogier made poor liars. He made placating gestures as though Min were the larger of them.
Well, I do, Min. Of course I do. Aerith is beautiful and very perceptive. Did I ever tell you how carefully she listened to me explain about... of course I did. I tell everybody I meet. I do want to marry her, but not yet. It isn't like with you humans, Min. You do everything Rand asks. Aerith will expect me to settle down and stay home. Wives never let a husband go anywhere or do anything, if it means leaving the steading for more than a few days. I have to finish my book, and how can I do that if I don't see everything Rand does? I'm sure he's done all sorts of things since I left Kyrian, and I know I'll never get it all down right. Aerith just wouldn't understand. Min, are you angry with me?
What makes you think I'm angry? She said coolly. Loyal sighed heavily, and so clearly in relief that Rand almost stared. Light, the Ogier actually thought she meant she was not angry. Rand knew he was feeling his way in the dark when it came to women, even men, maybe especially men. But Loyal had better learn a lot more than he already knew before he married his Aerith. Otherwise, she would skin him out like a sick goat. Best to get him out of the room before Min did Aerith's job for her. Rand cleared his throat. Think on it overnight, Loyal, he said. Maybe you'll change your mind by morning. Part of him hoped Loyal would. The Ogier had been too long from home. Another part of him, though, he could use Loyal if what Olivia had told him about the Seanchan was true. Sometimes he disgusted himself. In any case, I need to talk to Bashir now. And Logain. His mouth tightened around the name. What was Logain doing in Ashamon Black? Boyle did not stand. Indeed, his expression grew more troubled, ears slanting back and eyebrows drooping.
Rand, there is something I need to tell you about the Aes Sedai who came with us.
Lightnings flared anew outside the windows as he went on, and the thunder crashed overhead harder than ever. With such storms, a lull only meant the worst was coming. I told you to kill them all when you had the chance, Lews Therin laughed. I told you.
Are you positive they've been bonded, Samitsu? Cadsuane asked firmly, and loudly enough to be heard over the thunder booming on the manor house's rooftop. Thunder and lightning fit her mood. She would have liked to snarl. It required a goodly measure of her training and experience to sit calmly and sip hot ginger tea. She had not let emotion get the upper hand in a very long time, but she wanted to bite something or someone. Samitsu held a porcelain cup of tea, too, but she had yet to swallow a drop, and she had ignored Cadsuane's offer of a chair. The slender sister turned from peering into the flames of the left-hand fireplace, the bells in her dark hair jingling as she shook her head. She had not bothered to dry her hair properly, and it hung damp and heavy down her back. Her hazel eyes were uneasy. It's hardly the sort of question I could ask a sister, now is it, Cadsuane? And they certainly didn't tell me. As who would? At first I thought maybe they had done like Maurice and Kirill, and poor Daikyan. A brief wince of sympathy crossed her face. She knew in full the pain that was gnawing at Daikyan over her loss. Any sister beyond her first warder knew that too well. But it's plain Tovane and Gabriella are both with Logain. I think Gabriella is betting him. If there's bonding been done, it was the men who did it. Turnabout, Cadsuane muttered into her tea. Some said that turnabout was fair play, but she had never believed in fighting fair. Either you fought or you did not, and it was never a game. Fairness was for people standing safely to one side, talking while others bled. Unfortunately, there was little she could do beyond trying to find a way to balance events. Balance was not at all the same as fairness. What a dog's dinner this was turning into. I'm glad you gave me at least a little warning before I have to face Tovane and the others, but I want you to return to Kyrian the first thing tomorrow. There was nothing I could do, Cadsuane, Samitsu said bitterly. Half the people I gave an order had begun checking with Sashal to see if it was right, and the other half told me to my face she'd already said different. Lord Bashir talked her into turning the warders loose. I have no idea how he found out about them in the first place, and she talked Soralia into it, and there wasn't the least thing I could do to stop it. Soralia was behaving as if I had just abdicated. She doesn't understand, and she made it plain she thinks I'm a fool. There's no point at all in me going back, unless you expect me to carry Sashal's gloves for her. I expect you to watch her, Samitsu. No more than that. I want to know what one of these dragon-sworn sisters does when neither I nor the wise ones are looking over their shoulders and holding a switch. You've always been very observant. Patience was not always her strongest trait, but sometimes it was required with Samitsu. The Yellow was observant and intelligent and strong-willed most of the time, not to mention the best alive at healing, at least until the appearance of Dahmer Flynn. But she could suffer the most astonishing collapses in her confidence. The stick never worked with Samitsu, but pats on the back did, and it was ridiculous not to use what worked. As Cadsuane reminded her how intelligent she was, how skilled at healing, that was always necessary with Samitsu. She could go into a depression over failing to heal a dead man. How clever the Arafellan sister began to draw up her composure and her self-assurance. You can be assured Sashal won't change her stockings without I know it, she said crisply. In truth, Cadsuane expected no less. But if you don't mind me asking, with her confidence restored, Samitsu's tone made that the merest courtesy. She was no shrinking flower except when her self-assurance weakened. Why are you here at the back end of Tyr? What's young Althor going to do? Or should I say, what are you going to have him do? He intends something very dangerous, Cadsuane replied. Lightning flashed outside the windows, sharp silver forks in a sky near as dark as night. She knew exactly what he intended. She just did not know whether to stop it.
It has to end, Rand thundered, echoed by the crashes in the sky. He had doffed his coat before this interview and rolled up his shirt sleeves to bear the dragons twined around his forearms in scarlet and gold, the golden-maned heads resting on the backs of his hands. He wanted the man in front of him reminded with every look that he was facing the dragon reborn. But his hands were fists, to keep him from giving in to Luce Theron's urgings and throttling bloody Loghain Ablar. I don't need a war with the White Tower, and you bloody Ashaman bloody well won't give me a war with the White Tower. Do I make myself understood? Loghain, hands resting easily atop the long hilt of his sword, did not flinch. He was a big man, if smaller than Rand, with a steady gaze that gave no sign that he had been dressed down or called to account. The silver sword and red and gold dragon glittered brightly in the lamplight on the high collar of his black coat, and that itself looked freshly ironed. Are you saying release them? He asked calmly. Will the Aes Sedai release those of ours they've taken? No, Rand said curtly, and sourly. What's done can't be undone. Maurice had been so shocked when he suggested she release Narishma, you would have thought he was asking her to abandon a puppy by the side of the road. And he suspected Flynn would fight as hard to hang on to Kirill as she to him. He was fairly certain there was more between those two than the bond now. Well, if an Aes Sedai could bond a man who channeled, what was to say a pretty woman could not fix on a gimpy old man? You realize the mess you've created, though, don't you? As it is, the only man who can channel that Elida wants alive is me, and that only till the last battle is done. Once she learns of this, she'll be twice as hot to see you all dead any way she can manage it. I don't know how the other lot will react, but Egwene was always a sharp bargainer. I may have to tell off Ashaman for Aes Sedai to bond until they have as many of you as you do of them. As if they don't just decide you all have to die as soon as they can arrange it too. What's done is done, but there cannot be any more. Loghain stiffened a little more with every word, but his gaze held on Rand's. It was plain as horns on a ram that he was ignoring the others in the sitting room. Min had wanted no part of this meeting, and had taken herself off to read. Rand could not make up from down in Harriet Fell's books, but she found them fascinating. He had insisted Loyal remain, though, and the Ogier was pretending to study the flames in the fireplace. Except when he glanced at the door, tufted ears twitching as if wondering whether he could slip out unnoticed under cover of the storm. Davram Bashir appeared even shorter than he really was alongside the Ogier, a graying man with dark tilted eyes, a beak of a nose, and thick mustaches curving down around his mouth. He had worn his sword too, a shorter blade than Loghain's, and serpentine. Bashir spent more time peering into his wine cup than looking at anything else, but whenever his eyes touched Loghain, he unconsciously ran a thumb along his sword hilt. Rand thought it was unconscious. Naim gave the order, Loghain said, coldly uncomfortable explaining himself in front of an audience. Sudden lightning close to the house cast his face in lurid shadows for an instant, a bleak mask of darkness. I assumed it came from you. His eyes moved slightly in Bashir's direction, and his mouth tightened. Naim does a great many things people think are...
Alright, everyone, I'm going to call into this stream for tonight. I want to thank everyone for stopping by and everyone who continues to stop by. Appreciate all y'all's support. Until next time, stay safe.